There is a plate on the kitchen table. Dinner has already gone cold. Someone covered it with plastic wrap, neatly, as one would for someone they're expecting. Next to it is a glass of water and a napkin folded into a triangle. There isn't a single crumb on the tabletop. The house is quiet. On the second floor, a 10-month-old girl is sleeping in a crib with wooden rails, which her father assembled himself, following the instructions. In June, when it was sweltering outside, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. The man for whom this table is set will be dead in 12 hours, and the woman who prepared this dinner for him will, 5 years later, utter a single word in her own voice in a courtroom. Yes, sir. Her lawyer will say everything else for her. Eric's mother, Doris, would later recall a single phone call. She would recount it on camera for the CBS program 48 Hours, and her voice would break on every word, as if there were an abyss between them that she had to step over. A few days before the end, Eric called her in Indiana. His voice was weak but calm. He said he was feeling better, that he had come home from the hospital, that Anne was taking care of him, cooking meals, keeping track of his medications, never leaving his side. Doris wanted to fly out, but Eric said, "Don't, Mom. Everything's fine now. Don't worry." She hung up and thought the worst was over. A few days later, she was standing in the intensive care unit at Rex Hospital in Raleigh, looking at her son's body, a tube in his mouth, because they had been trying to resuscitate him, cold skin. She wanted to cover him with a blanket because it seemed to her that he was cold, but he was already nothing. To understand what happened in that house in Raleigh, North Carolina, in November and December of the year 2000, you first need to see Eric Miller not through a biography or an obituary, but through a single living moment, through a scene in which he exists in his entirety, not as a victim, not as a name in a case file, but as a person with habits, hand, a voice, and plans for tomorrow. Eric grew up in rural Indiana, in a family where they gathered around the same table on Sundays, and his father knew every neighbor within a 2-mile radius by name. A close-knit, warm, secure childhood, without extra money, and without the feeling that they didn't have enough. In high school, he played tennis. Not a star, not a prodigy, but stubborn, the kind who loses a set and returns to serve with the same expression. At Purdue University, he studied biology and chemistry with the obsession of someone who believes that science can fix the world. Not in an abstract way, but concretely, like a mechanic believes in a wrench. There's a problem, there's a tool, you have to get to work. After defending his dissertation at North Carolina State University in '98, he faced a choice that really determined everything. A pharmaceutical company offered a high salary, the kind of salary that buys a house with a lawn, a new car, and 2 vacations a year. But there was also a federal grant for research on pediatric AIDS. The grant paid little. The grant meant a cramped office, old equipment, and years without a raise. Eric chose the grant. His work at the Lineberger Cancer Center at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill involved the most vulnerable group of patients, children born with a virus that, in the year 2000, was still synonymous with a death sentence. He was a postdoc, a researcher without a permanent position, without guarantees, on a temporary contract that had to be renewed every year based on his results. Colleagues described him succinctly: quiet, meticulous, passionate. A man who could sit for hours poring over test results and forget about lunch. A man who never raised his voice and never asked for more than he needed. At home, in a small house in Raleigh, life looked like a postcard from a catalog of country cottages, only cheaper than in the catalog. He didn't earn much, but in January 2000, he and Anne had a daughter, Claire, and his face that day, according to relatives, was the face of a man who had received everything he wanted. Eric's sister, Leanne McGee, would later recount how he held the baby in his arms and said he wanted to teach her to play tennis, that he was already looking for a small racket. He was making plans 10 years ahead, which schools, which clubs, where to go in the summer. His voice, when he spoke of the future, sounded as if the future were a promise that someone had already fulfilled. The last thing he said to his mother on the phone before his final hospitalization, "I'm finally feeling better." Remember that phrase. It will come back. Ann Breyer met Eric at Purdue. Their friends called them Ken and Barbie. She was blonde, he was athletic, both attractive, both with good grades. The chemistry between them was obvious to everyone. Leanne would later say that when Eric introduced her to Anne, she immediately sensed the difference. It wasn't like it had been with his previous girlfriends. Anne studied chemistry, the real kind, in the lab, with test tubes and reagents. Eric proposed to her on Valentine's Day. Her roommate, Renee C., would say in an interview, "It was the happiest time of Anne's life. She was marrying the man of her dreams." After graduating in '92, they moved to Raleigh together to continue their studies. Two young scientists in love with each other. It sounds like the beginning of a good story. And for a while, it was a good story. But then something shifted, slowly, imperceptibly, like a crack in the foundation that creeps for years. Anne started her doctoral program and dropped out. She wanted a different life, a nicer house, a newer car, a boat. Eric's postdoc salary didn't come close to covering those desires. She got a job as a researcher at GlaxoSmithKline, a British pharmaceutical giant with a large lab complex in Research Triangle Park, not far from Raleigh. Money came in. With the money came what Eric's sister would call an obsession with appearance, breast augmentation, cosmetic procedures, expensive clothes, manicures, everything impeccable every day, without exception. Forensic psychologist Michael Tigg would later say, appearance was extremely important to her. How she dressed, her makeup, her hair, everything down to her toenail. Anne was crafting an image, the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect home, the perfect life. She and Eric even volunteered in a church program to help married couples. They helped other people save their marriage. From the outside, everything looked right, maybe even perfect. But Lieutenant Chris Morgan of the Raleigh Police Department would later say one thing that explains Anne more accurately than any psychological profile, more accurately than any textbook. When asked why she didn't divorce Eric, after all, she had other men. After all, she obviously wanted a different life. He would reply, she couldn't get a divorce, because in Anne's world, divorce means admitting that you're imperfect. One sentence, and the whole mechanism becomes clear. Not passion, not madness, calculation, ingrained in her self-esteem. Even before her affair with Daryl Willard, a GlaxoSmithKline employee who would later become her accomplice, Anne had been cheating on her husband with a man from California. Flights across the country, secret meetings in expensive New York hotels and on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. She paid for everything herself, tickets, rooms, dinners. Eric stayed home with the baby. Eric knew nothing. He believed he had a good family. He believed it until the very last day. Daryl Willard, 37 years old, a biochemist, Anne's colleague at GlaxoSmithKline, married to a vet, daughter, Kelsey. His wife would later speak of him in an interview, and there would be no anger or bitterness in her voice, only loss. He was a wonderful father. Kelsey adored him. Colleagues, a respected expert, reliable, a professional, not the kind of person you'd associate with the word murder. But in the fall of 2000, he and Anne began an affair. Phone records, which the police would later retrieve, would show 576 minutes of calls, more than 100 calls over the course of the fall. Long nighttime conversations, sometimes past midnight, playful text messages. Anne loved socializing after work. She'd bring colleagues home, organize get-togethers, go bowling. Eric knew Daryl. He considered him a friend of his wife's. He'd have a beer with him. He saw no threat. No one did. In the fall of 2000, the Miller family's world looks stable, well-established. Eric works in a lab in Chapel Hill, comes home late, plays with 10-month-old Claire before bed. Anne commutes to work at Research Triangle Park. In the evenings, they sometimes have dinner together, and sometimes Anne invites friends over for bowling. The house is clean, the lawn is mowed, and the fridge is stocked with groceries for the week ahead. Eric is planning the next phase of his research. He is healthy, 30 years old, full of energy. At his last routine checkup, the doctors found absolutely nothing wrong with him. But if someone had analyzed his hair at that moment, the very analysis that would only be performed after his death and whose results would turn the whole case upside down, they would have found arsenic. Dating back to the summer of 2000, 4 months before that evening when the symptoms would become visible, someone was already poisoning Eric Miller slowly, regularly at the dinner table. Wednesday, November 15, 2000. Evening. Eric is driving with Anne and several of her colleagues from GlaxoSmithKline to the AMF Bowling Center in Raleigh. A typical after-work evening. Sneakers, painted lanes, the clatter of pins, the smell of oil and beer from the vending machine. Daryl Willard buys a pitcher of beer for everyone, pours it into plastic cups, and hands them out. Eric takes a sip. He grimaces. "This beer tastes kinda weird," he says to someone in the group, a phrase that investigators, journalists, and prosecutors would later repeat over and over, like a mark on a timeline. Eric doesn't finish his cup. He keeps playing. A few more frame, and then, about an hour later, he starts feeling sick. First nausea, then stomach pain, then worse. Abruptly, like a cliff edge. He thinks he's been poisoned. Maybe the hot dog was stale. Maybe the beer was from an expired keg. By nightfall, his condition worsens so much that Anne drives him to the emergency room at Rex Hospital in Raleigh. November 16th, hospitalization. The symptoms look like severe flu or acute food poisoning, vomiting, stomach pain, weakness so severe he can't stand up. The doctors can't figure out why a healthy 30-year-old man is in such bad shape. A few days pass. He doesn't get any better. On November 21st, he is transferred to the University of North Carolina Memorial Hospital in Chapel Hill. They have more resources and better diagnostic facilities. Blood is drawn, and the samples are sent to the lab. The results won't come back right away. The process takes time, and no one flags this as an urgent case. While the tests are being processed, Eric slowly, little by little, starts to get better. The vomiting stops. He begins to eat. The color returns to his face. On Friday, November 24th, he is discharged. He returns home. He moves with difficulty, can't work, but he smiles. His parents, Doris and Veras, fly in from Indiana. They help around the house, watch over Claire, cook, and clean. Anne is there too, caring, attentive, organized. She cooks for her husband, monitors his regimen, and brings him his medication, a picture of recovery. His parents watch this and think the crisis is over. They head back to Indiana. And the results of those tests from Chapel Hill, the ones still being processed in the lab, will show the presence of arsenic in his blood, but they won't arrive in time. Eric Miller will never know about them. Between November 24th and December 1st, 6 days, Eric is at home, alone, with his wife. His parents have left. Colleagues don't come by. He's too weak for visitors. He eats what Anne cooks. He drinks what she brings him. 6 days of silence, during which he thinks he's recovering. 6 days during which he calls his mother and says the phrase I asked him to remember. On November 30th or December 1st, the exact date varies by source, Eric has dinner with his wife. After dinner, he feels sick again. This time, it's not just sick, a catastrophe. Unstoppable vomiting, convulsions, hallucinations. Leanne, his sister, would later recount in an interview for the show Snapped. He was literally thrashing on the table. We had to hold him down. Anne takes him back to Rex Hospital. At the hospital, his condition worsens by the hour. He stops recognizing the people around him. His body is failing systematically, one organ after another, like light switches in a house, which someone is flipping off one by one. And at some point, Anne is left alone with him in the ward. Later, months, years, and a legal battle that reached the North Carolina Supreme Court. It will become known exactly what happened in that ward. Daryl Willard would tell his lawyer, Richard Gammon, shortly before his own death, that he had met with Anne in the parking lot, in the car. Anne was crying, and she told him she had been alone in the hospital room with her husband. She took a syringe and a needle out of her purse and injected the contents of the syringe into Eric's IV. When Daryl asked why she did it, Anne replied with 3 words, I don't know. 3 words that would later appear in every court document, every journalistic investigation, every conversation about this case. 3 words instead of an answer. Saturday, December 2nd, 2000. Eric Miller dies at Rex Hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. He is 30 years old. His heart stops. The doctors try to resuscitate him, but they're too late. Shortly before his death, A blood test finally reveals what no one had specifically been looking for: arsenic. A concentration incompatible with life. But the result comes too late to change anything, too late to save him. Doris and Varys arrive a few minutes after his heart stopped. Doris sees her son's body, and later she will recount this on camera in a voice that sounds as if every word causes physical pain. He was lying in bed with a tube in his mouth because they were trying to resuscitate him. He was cold, and I wanted to pull that tube out. I wanted to cover him up because he was cold. The Raleigh Police Department begins an investigation that same day. Detective Deborah Regenton obtains a search warrant and searches the Miller's home. Every bottle of shampoo, every bottle of conditioner, every bar of soap, every liquid, the entire contents of the refrigerator. Eric's lab in Chapel Hill is combed through. No trace of arsenic. Lieutenant Morgan initially considers the possibility of accidental poisoning. Maybe something dripped onto food in the lab, maybe a chemical leak. But toxicologist Dr. Tom Clark dismisses this theory with a single sentence. The concentration of arsenic in Eric Miller's system is such that accidental exposure is completely ruled out. This is no accident, no coincidence. This is murder. Morgan builds a profile. The killer had access to arsenic, had access to Eric, and knew that arsenic poisoning mimics the symptoms of the common flu and almost never. It cannot be detected without a targeted toxicological analysis. Someone from the scientific community, someone close to her. During her first interrogation, on the day of her husband's death, Anne plays her part flawlessly. Her father supports her by the arm. She is crying, barely able to stand. She says she doesn't understand who could have poisoned Eric. Detective Regenton recalls, she seemed completely broken, very weak. Eric's family initially defends their daughter-in-law. They don't believe she's involved. Anne directs their suspicions elsewhere. Daryl was obsessed with her, she says. He stalked her, wouldn't leave her alone. Maybe he wanted to get rid of Eric so he could be with her. The family believes her for a while, and then Anne takes a series of actions, each of which can be explained individually, but together they look like a plan. Immediately after the autopsy, she orders Eric's body to be cremated, despite the fact that his parents want to bury their son in Indiana. Cremation eliminates the possibility of a second autopsy. Then she hires two of North Carolina's top criminal defense attorneys and refuses any further contact with the police. Every request for an interview is turned down. Leanne recalls, Anne and her father were late to the funeral home because they had been with the lawyers, and phone records will show that on the night Eric died, Anne called Daryl Willard well past midnight. Daryl Willard, meanwhile, is avoiding the police. He doesn't answer calls or show up for meeting. Morgan wants to talk to him more than anyone else because it was Daryl who poured Eric that beer at the bowling alley. It was Daryl who works at the same company as Anne, and it was Daryl and Anne who exchanged hundreds of calls that fall. On January 21st, 2001, the police obtain a search warrant for the Willards' home. They confiscate documents and computers. Morgan takes Daryl aside. He is standing at the door of his house, and Morgan later describes his face with words that sound like an epitaph. He looked like a man who had suffered a complete defeat. Morgan decides to take a chance. Daryl, he says, I think a woman used you. Daryl looks up. His expression is somewhere between despair and relief. Yes, he replies, and she did a great job of it. And then, I can't talk anymore. I need to call my lawyer. He gets into Morgan's car and dials Richard Gammon's number. Morgan stands outside, wishing he could hear the conversation. He's certain Daryl is the key. On January 22nd, a day later, Yvette Willard comes home from work and finds her husband dead in the garage. A gunshot wound to the head, suicide. A note lies nearby. It contains an apology to his family and a single sentence. I was accused of an act for which I am not responsible. I took no life but my own. The only person who could tell the truth has fallen silent forever. The case is dismissed. Anne remains silent behind a wall of lawyers. Daryl is dead. The police don't have enough evidence to press charges. Prosecutor Colleen Willoughby will say it plainly. There isn't enough evidence. But in May of that same year, the full autopsy report is released, and it overturns everything the investigators knew up to that point. Forensic pathologist Dr. Tom Clark establishes two facts. First, Eric received at least 2 doses of arsenic, one of them in the hospital. It is highly likely that this was the fatal dose. Someone entered the ward where he was lying under an IV drip and killed him there. The second fact is even more terrifying. A hair analysis detects the presence of arsenic 4 months before the bowling incident, the summer of 2000. Long before the police believe Ann's affair with Daryl began, someone was already poisoning Eric Miller back then. And arsenic, as Morgan will say, is not the kind of weapon that's used from a distance. Morgan is rethinking the whole case. The Daryl acted alone theory no longer holds up. Daryl didn't have access to Eric at home, at the kitchen table, every day. But Ann did. The only lead is Daryl's conversation with Attorney Gammon. That very call the day before the suicide. Attorney-client privilege. Gammon cannot disclose the contents without a court order. Morgan asks directly, "Rick, when are you going to tell us what Daryl told you?" The answer, "You know I can't do that until a judge orders me to." A legal battle begins that will go through 3 courts over 3 years. Yvette Willard attempts to waive attorney-client privilege on behalf of the heirs. She wants the truth to come out. She believes her husband did not kill Eric. The trial court, the appellate court, the North Carolina Supreme Court, each court addresses a question that had never before been raised so sharply in American jurisprudence. Does attorney-client privilege survive the client's death? All this time, Morgan doesn't leave. He postpones his retirement for more than a year. Every day he sees Eric Miller's name on the wall at the precinct, the list of unsolved murders. At home, on the bulletin board, a photograph. Eric, Ann, and little Claire, all smiling. He tells Eric's parents he won't drop the case. The Eric Miller case cost me sleepless nights. It got under my skin. Meanwhile, Ann is rebuilding her life completely in 6 months. She moves to Wilmington, 120 miles from Raleigh, far away from the police. She marries Paul Kantz, a guitarist in a Christian rock band. She changes jobs. Now she's an interior designer. A new city, a new husband, a new last name. Morgan later asks, "Is that the behavior you'd expect from a woman whose husband was killed in such a brutal way?" In the spring of 2004, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled Gammon must hand over the information. And in the lawyer's notes, written from the dead man's words, appears what had been missing for 4 years. Daryl told Gammon he met Ann in the parking lot, in the car. She was crying. She said she had been alone in the hospital room with her husband. She took a syringe and a needle out of her purse. She injected the contents into the IV. When Daryl asked why, she replied, "I don't know." On September 27, 2004, a grand jury indicted Ann Miller Cones on charges of first-degree murder. Bail was set at $3 million. She couldn't afford it. On November 8, 2005, without waiting for trial, she pleads guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy. She admits to poisoning her husband at least twice, acting in concert with Daryl. Sentenced 25 to 31.5 years. Her lawyer reads a statement. Ann does not speak in her own voice in the courtroom, not a word. Through her lawyer, "For reasons I do not yet understand, I allowed myself to knowingly participate in events that cost my husband his life." And standing opposite her are those to whom she meant everything. Pam, Eric's sister. "Ann, why won't you look at me? Why did you brutally murder my brother?" Leanne, "I'll never understand why you didn't just divorce him." Doris, "I have a hole in my heart and pain in my chest with every breath. I'll never hold him again. He'll never sit at my table." Anne lowers her head and cries quietly. Virus, Eric's father, stands and says, "She wants forgiveness. But where has forgiveness been for the last 5 years? She's sorry she got caught. But a sentence is a procedure. But the story isn't. Chris Morgan has retired. The photograph of Eric, Ann, and Claire still hangs in his home. Yvette Willard lives in the house where her husband shot himself in the garage and says that Daryl wasn't a murderer, he was used. Doris Miller never received her son's body for the funeral. Ann had arranged for cremation before. Anyone could object. There is one thing in this story that no one has explained. Not the motive, that is clear. Another man, a refusal to admit failure through divorce, perfection as the only acceptable form of existence. It's monstrous, but logical. The inexplicable lies elsewhere. In those 6 days between his discharge and his final hospitalization, when Eric lay at home, weakened, grateful, trusting, what did she feel as she set the plate on the table as she sat down across from him, as she watched him eat. She knew what was in that food. She knew he would die. She knew he trusted her completely to the very end without a single question, because she was his wife. And then she took a syringe, entered the ward where he lay hooked up to an IV, and injected the poison into his bloodstream. In the North Carolina healthcare system in the year 2000, there was no protocol for mandatory testing for heavy metal poisoning upon readmission with the same symptoms. Doctors looked for a virus, an infection, an autoimmune reaction, anything but arsenic. One simple test could have saved his life. It wasn't done. Not out of negligence, but because the system didn't account for this possibility. That blind spot hasn't gone away. Eric Miller wanted to teach his daughter to play tennis. Claire was 10 months old when he died. She doesn't remember his voice. She doesn't remember him holding her in his arms. She doesn't remember the words he said to her mother on the phone a few days before he died. I'm finally feeling better. Stories like this don't end here. Leave your opinion in the comments, subscribe, and see you in the next issue.